Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Fireside Chats. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing with our discussion about the gurus of this line of self-realization. We've been talking about Master Yogananda and Swami Kriyananda now for many, many days. And today might be our last day on this subject. We'll see what happens. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence within our hearts, that we not get confused by the many unsettling realities of this world, the many conflicts we feel within ourselves between desire, aspiration, and the clear experience of your guiding presence. Make yourself known to us. Whisper to us in a voice loud enough that it can be heard through all the confusion of our own minds. We are your children. Comfort us, guide us, bring us home to thy eternal bliss. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, I believe I have not yet given a whole morning to the idea of Divine Mother. And if I have, we're doing it again. Talking about Yogananda, about Master, about the specific reasons he came to America and what he was bringing. And that's what I've been doing over the last so many days, I don't know, 10 or 12 sessions. Talking about putting the responsibility for spirituality right in our own hands, giving us practical techniques. I talked yesterday about cooperation, and part of the aspect of cooperation, which I realize I didn't mention, which is important to say. Oh no, I talked about nature yesterday. Cooperation was the day before. But one aspect of cooperation that I failed to mention as strongly as I might have is something that Swami Kriyananda wrote in the end of The Path. He said it's not only necessary to spiritualize our relationship with God, but we also have to spiritualize our relationship with the objective world, especially in our relationships with other people. And again, this is not as self-evident as you might think, because up until really the dawning of Dwapara Yuga, you made your relationship right with God, and that was sufficient. That got you into heaven and got you away from hell. But once spirituality becomes integrated into daily life, it's not that we become worldly. It's that we have to become spiritual in the context of everything else that we're doing. And therefore, we have to see the divine dimension in everything else that we're doing. And talking yesterday about Mother Nature as a channel for Divine Mother. We were talking about how everything in creation is a manifestation of the divine. And Swamiji, in this particular chapter, paragraphs in his book, he's talking about spiritual family. And he's talking about the relationships that we have with one another that are new in each incarnation, in the sense that every one of us has a different body now. And perhaps because of the particular context of how that body was acquired and what we associated ourselves with in getting it, we might be oriented in a slightly different way, perhaps, than we met in the past. Different culture, different needs of the time, different yuga of the age, perhaps different lessons, because other lessons have been learned, or even if they haven't been learned, that now we're focusing on different things. So there's always a sort of getting reacquainted with what the parts are now. But we're sort of, you might call, we're a repertoire company, a theater repertoire company, and the actor appears now, he's playing the captain, in the next play he's playing the invalided mother, and then the next time he's the ingenue, or she's the ingenue because he has become she. But as actors, we all sort of recognize each other from the continuing features that are not changed merely because the costume and the lines are changed. And so Swamiji talks about how one of the important things that happens in a very old spiritual family like this one is that we gradually have to bring to divine perfection, or at least as close as we can. Well, let me phrase it differently. We do have to bring to divine perfection within ourselves our ability to relate to everyone and everything in the world. That doesn't mean we have to wait for everyone else to also get it together. If you have karma with someone, for example, maybe very bad karma, maybe they murdered you, or they were cruel to you in some way, or betrayed you, you don't have to wait until they transcend that confusion within themselves and apologize to you. You have to simply come to perfect equanimity and surrender within yourself. And then if the person who was the catalyst for that lesson for you is still wandering around in that delusion, they still have to work it out, but they will find a stand-in for you, someone else whose karma is appropriate, and then they will get to work those qualities out within themselves. What I'm trying to say is, it's all about our own individual consciousness. When our consciousness is perfected, we cease to have karma with anyone else, even though they may, you might say, in a sense, have karma with you. But when there's no you, there's no egoic you there to receive that karma, then they take it somewhere where there is an ego that's similar enough that will allow them to work it out, which is a great relief, because otherwise our progress would be completely held back by other people's progress. Now, the reason Swamiji talks about this, multiple reasons why he talks about it, above all, it's to expand our Dwapara sense of spirituality. But this is not so unknown. Even in the most cloistered monastery, the relationships and the difficulties or the positives that are created by brothers and sisters together in those situations is the catalyst for our spiritual growth. But what Swami is also doing is he's elevating our relationships with each other to be a fundamental part of our spiritual life. Because we're spiritual family, and because these relationships are sent to us by God, and because within spiritual family is the ideal way to work on ourselves, because there is a supportive goodness involved there. So I'm going back to cooperation because I didn't give this enough of an emphasis. The need for community is not only that it will solve the many problems of this age. So many of the difficulties of this age are resolved if people could live in small, spiritually focused, cooperative communities. And that's why Master called it the social pattern of the future. And he said the idea of communities would spread like wildfire. I mean, those of us who have been involved in this for a long time have been waiting for the wildfire to strike. Swamiji has made the very interesting comment that history will show that the most important thing going on right now is Ananda. Swamiji was not inclined to grandiose statements about the work that we were doing. And in fact, he was just the opposite. He felt it was extremely unwholesome for us to have too grandiose an idea of what we're doing. For one thing, it distracts you from the work at hand. And the second, obviously, is it makes you, the egoic temptation is overwhelming. And that sense of self-importance is exactly the opposite of childlike freedom. But nonetheless, he would make that statement. when I look around at the difficulties that are infecting, is the word I want to use, infecting our world in every country, I realize how many of them I personally have avoided, and everybody could avoid by being part of a community. It gives you family, it gives you like-minded friends, it gives you the ability to accomplish much more because you're working together. It gives you the ability to live much more simply because you combine resources. It gives you an extraordinary sense of security in an age when there isn't any. And when you're associated with people whose character you know, it's an entirely different reality than when you're working with strangers. In this week, when I've been talking, I was talking about how the different advances in communication, each time one of them comes, starting with the printing press, going to the telegraph, then going to the radio, then going to the internet, each time what it does, it makes it less and less possible for each person to have a direct connection to the source of the information that's given to them. And when you don't have a direct connection to the source, then fraud becomes much easier. And then when fraud becomes more prevalent, then our security about what is true declines in a precipitous rate, which is where we are right now. And until we figure out as human beings how to restore some sense of confidence in the sources of information, we're really very, very largely at sea, which is what's happening right now. A friend of mine was talking to me yesterday about, valid, persuasive information that has come to him, supporting some fairly extreme theories. When we were discussing it, I don't necessarily think that some of those conspiracy theories are wrong. There's too much evidence and too much common sense involved in it. I remember this was, of course, many years ago, when there was a tremendous softening between the Soviet Union and the United States, um, whatever they called it. And the Communist Party seemed to be putting down some of its more draconian ways of governing, and this would have been somewhere in the very early 90s. And I remember it was a discussion in our temple. At that point in our temple was this storefront place that we had. But I remember there was this man from Bulgaria in the room when we were talking. And he was a young man, and he'd had to flee Bulgaria in the middle of the night because he had so antagonized the government leaders that his life was in danger. And so he'd managed to escape, is the only word for it. And he just looked at us and he said, "You people are so naive." He said, "I know those people." He said, "People like that, they're not going to give up their power." He said, "Whatever they appear to be doing, that's not what they're doing." And I know Swami Kriyananda also, during that same period of time, he also said, when you've had an oppressive government and people who want that kind of power, who have that kind of power, he says, karma like that doesn't just end. He said, it may go underground. It may sort of find a more hidden way to express itself. He said, but power, attachment to power like that and that kind of shadow force, he says, it doesn't just end. The people who live that way don't just say, oh my goodness, we were wrong. Let's be nice from now on. But all of this is to talk about the insecurity that we live with. And by contrast, and of course this is such a tiny example, but by contrast, in the world that I live in, it's always been my habit whenever I hear anything, I always ask who said that. And when somebody's talking about, well, this person did this and this person did that, and sometimes people are trying to be a little protective of identities, and I say, I just can't have this conversation unless I know who we're talking about. Not because I want to judge them, but very simply because I know people and I know their character. And so when a statement is made, there's a context for it. It doesn't just sort of sail into me and appear on my computer screen with absolutely no antecedents. And when we know each other, then the whole flow of human relationships is quite different. And people speak nostalgically of, the little villages and when we did know each other, but there's a much more profound thought behind that, because we spiritualize our relation to the world by interacting with it, and especially and above all, interacting with other people. And then to use the word cooperation, which seems to be where I'm back with today, we learn to cooperate with each other. When Ananda was accused in a lawsuit that went from 1994 to 1998, which was the Ananda is a terrible cult set up for the personal gratification and aggrandizement primarily of Swami Kriyananda, but with a few of his chosen minions as well. Just write out your most extreme, dramatic, you are a cult accusations, and we received them all. And we had to play our way through it. And the heart of the drama was a married man who happened also to be a minister who'd had a consensual sexual affair with a single woman. And in the end, he decided to stay with his wife and child, and she was enraged. And so she found people who would support her and pay for her lawsuit, who also had their own reason to want Ananda to be pulled down. And there you were. We were off to the races. Total fabrication, just ludicrously fabricated, which was part of the problem because it was so ludicrous that we didn't imagine it could ever get traction. Swamiji knew because he knew human nature. See, a great deal of what's going on in our society right now is those of us who live at a more refined plane have lost awareness of how human emotion can be whipped up and directed in ways that are truly horrifying. In recent history, we have Hitler, who was considered more or less a buffoon by people who were intellectually oriented, but it was their extraordinary naivete not to understand how mob psychology works. And so they would sit on the sidelines and take pot shots at what Hitler and his minions were doing, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't appealing to reason. He was appealing to pure gut feeling and fear and the incipient desire for power that is inherent in many people. And we're in a similar reality where there is a tremendous amount of base passion being deliberately stirred up, and people who are not so motivated in that way, sitting on the sidelines and not taking it seriously. I really don't know what's going to happen in that respect. It depends on the karma of the country. It depends on the karma of the planet. Everybody will stand forth and hold to their point of view and do their best. But it depends on what forces, Divine Mother wants to unleash on our world. So let's see, coming back to where we were, if I can remember where we were, I was talking about the litigation and a particular moment that happened. So what happened was, among other things, Ananda is a charitable family. And because we know each other, and because we have a shared aspiration for divine perfection, and because we understand that you don't come into Ananda perfect, you come into Ananda with a deep desire to become perfect, and your inclusion in the family is based on your sincerity, on the sincerity of your efforts, not necessarily on the perfection of your achievements, but the sincerity of your efforts. When people prove themselves to be insincere in their efforts, almost always the magnetism of their lack of attunement with what the community is really all about causes them to leave on their own. Only in very rare instances, in fact, only one or two, has anyone ever had to be asked to leave. Because usually they just find themselves so out of step with what's going on that they realize it's not their home and move on from there. Although Swamiji has said, most people who come and go from Ananda, which is the vast majority of people come and go. Even though the community has grown, the number of people who come and leave is infinitely higher, much higher than the number of those who come and stay. He said most people who leave just leave, and Ananda either fades completely from their memory, or they have a warm feeling about the time they spent there, or a negative feeling, but it's not important in their lives. And then Swamiji said, there are some people upon whom Ananda has such a profound effect that they spend the rest of their lives trying to resolve their feelings about it. And the feeling usually is that if I failed to live up to the life of Ananda, it cannot be because I failed. It must be because Ananda is wrong. And so, as Swamiji said, every spiritual organization, and this is classic to spiritual organizations, develops a coterie of what he called shadow people, who just sort of hide in the shadows, but feel it is their God-given divine duty to unmask the hypocrisy of the spiritual organization in which they failed to succeed. So Ananda has a splendid coterie of such people. So what happened, though, in the course of this lawsuit is because we're based on charity, and we're based on the belief that anybody who sincerely wants to improve themselves, it is our responsibility as spiritual friends to help each other. Now, the position of the world is really quite different, especially nowadays in regard to sexual matters, even between consenting adults. That it is necessary to sternly reprimand and, if possible, shame and throw out onto the street all such people. And that's what we do now. Anybody who's even accused is shamed and expelled and denigrated forever. Now, I recognize that there is much wrong that has to be corrected, but I also recognize that not every accusation is true. And I also recognize that such an attitude does not help people to grow and is not wholesome for those who exercise it. I'm not going to go far into that because it's too big a subject. But what I finally realized at a certain point in the trial that we were going through, that what we were being accused of was actually trying to be charitable, to help the man save his marriage for the sake of the wife and the child, as well as for the man, to help the woman reconcile herself to the disappointment that the love affair was not going to continue, to help everybody involved to feel the grace of God in the midst of this and learn whatever karmic lessons were necessary, transcend them, and go on to become better and more noble people. Over many years of community living, this was not a naive hope. This was not wishful thinking. By charity, kindness, faith in one another, appropriate response, which is not to say anything goes. There are definitely, unequivocally, lines in the sand, and, this is appropriate and uplifting behavior, and this is not. But as Jesus said when they wanted to stone the woman caught in adultery, whoever among you is without sin, you may cast the first stone. And one by one, everybody left because they knew themselves. But what we were being accused of was actually trying to help them rather than condemn them. Trying to help them rather than condemn them and cut them off and throw them out into the street and never let them darken our doorways again. And instead, we tried to be supportive and charitable. And one Sunday, when this all came clear to me, I stood up during the time of the sermon and I said, I would rather Ananda fail completely than that we become the kind of organization they're trying to make us become. Oh, you sinned, let us draw you in front of the community and, if not literally, at least verbally and in every other way, stone you and then throw you off the balcony and, even literally hope that you starve to death. but certainly not even throw you a crust. I mean, that was literally what we were being asked to do and condemned for not doing. I said, who are we? What are we? We're a spiritual family, and we're here to help each other. If people don't want our help, and if people show themselves unable or absolutely unwilling to accept what we have to give, then we can let them go. We can bless them. We don't have to chase them. Our place is not to impose our teaching on anyone or to say, you'll be damned to hell if you don't follow us, or we're the only path in the world. This is why Swamiji always preferred to understate it. That's why his statement that Ananda would be so important in the future was so interesting, because it was so uncharacteristic of him to say something like that. There are many true paths, and everybody has to find their own way. This is ours, and we love it, and we believe in it, and we believe in its contribution. Otherwise, why would we all be working so hard to make it successful? But let's just see where I was. Just a moment. I have to find the thought again. But we've seen the method work. Swamiji's constant emphasis was never on what we did wrong, but also on what we have done right. Now, this as a community way of living, that's what I was going to say. I wanted to come back to the word cooperation. You see, that's where the word cooperation is really interesting. We don't have obedience in our spiritual organization, and Swami himself, who had every right by every spiritual measure to ask for that, never asked for that. We actually finally came to the word cooperative obedience, but Swami's actual words were, I just want your cooperation. And the cooperative obedience meant simply that we would respect spiritual authority. We're not a community that runs on consensus. We respect spiritual authority, but we cooperate with it. We don't surrender our own will, our own thoughts to it. So each one of us, on this spiritual path, we cooperate with the Guru. We cooperate with the Guru's efforts to make us free. And if that cooperation rises to the level of an absolute faith in what the Guru is asking of us, that faith is born on cooperation. It's not born on starting from, I must have that to begin. What I must have in order to begin is the willingness to do my best, to cooperate with what's being asked of me. And cooperation, even sometimes we say intelligent cooperative obedience, which is that whatever I need to do this successfully, my spiritual family will do its best to provide that for me, which sometimes, in talking about the litigation in that, is compassion and support. I remember when a man in this community failed rather publicly in an endeavor he'd set out to achieve, and that failure was a source of great embarrassment to him. And he came to me and he said, he said, I just don't know what to do. He said, I'm so embarrassed by my public humiliation, because I was supposed to do this thing and I was supposed to do it so well, and nothing worked. I said, this is such a charitable community. I said, if you just lift up your chin and look everybody right in the eye and just speak to them as if there was nothing happening, I said, in 24 hours, it'll all be over. I said, not only will people be compassionate in your failure, they'll be so impressed by your courage that instead of it being a black mark on your life, it'll actually become a shining star. Look how well he recovered from that stumble and has gone on with so much strength. I mean, that's who we are. That's what it is to spiritualize your relationship with people. A friend of mine got himself into a lot of trouble. The past of every saint has a past and every sinner has a future, my favorite expression right now. One of the very saintly people at Ananda, when he was in his past, he did some things that were pretty outrageous. And I wasn't even a close friend of his, but we knew each other. And I remember I ran into him on the village green at the village where we both lived. He walked right up to me, just right up to me, looked me right in the eye, and he said it like this, and it was true. He said, "Of course you've heard," meaning you've heard what happened to me. He said, "What do you think?" And all I could think of was, "You are a great man." I mean, what he'd done was really pretty remarkable in terms of, creative delusion. But it was, and I could also see that was not easy for him to do because he had pride like anyone else and he was terribly embarrassed and very foolish. But what's the best way to get over this? He just walked right into it, and it was absolutely thrilling and actually became a model for me. I learned a lot from that. Of course, you've heard. What do you think about it? Just cooperating with the whole community's desire to help him. He just made it so easy to help him. And then he just sailed right through it. And now it's become literally the past of a saint, because that's how we grow. We cooperate with grace. We cooperate with each other. We cooperate with Divine Mother. That's what God is asking of us. God bless you.